Okay. Is this good?
Yep.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Joel Veldkamp. Mr. Cave told you a little bit about me. Mrs. Veldkamp is my mom. Stella is my sister. I went here from preschool through senior year, and I'm really happy to be back here with you guys. Thanks for letting me interrupt your normally scheduled programming. I work for an organization called Christian Solidarity International, or CSI for short, since that's kind of a mouthful. We are a Christian human rights group. Our mission is to try to help Christians who are persecuted for their faith overseas. Christians are persecuted in many, many countries across the world. And for my job, I've been privileged to be able to visit many of these countries and talk to some of the brave Christian people who are suffering for their faith, who face discrimination, forced displacement from their homes, bombings, torture, kidnapping, enslavement, and often death, just because they call Jesus Christ Lord. And today I want to talk to you about what's going on with Christians in just two of these countries, Sudan and Iraq. And like Mr. Cave said, I was here 2 years ago. Some of you might remember me. I talked a lot about Sudan that time. Today, Sudan is divided into two countries, Northern Sudan and Southern Sudan. North Sudan is majority Muslim, and South Sudan is majority Christian. But before South Sudan became its own country, a radical government in North Sudan was trying to exterminate the Christians in the South. And one of the ways they tried to do that was by enslaving people. They would raid Christian villages and towns, kill all the men, kidnap all the women and children, and take them into slavery in North Sudan. And tens of thousands of Christians are still there, still enslaved in North Sudan, still hoping to be free someday. And when I was here 2 years ago, I told you about the underground network that CSI has in Sudan that works to smuggle these people out of slavery and back to freedom in the South. I told you about how it usually costs us about $50 worth of cattle vaccine to secure a person's release from slavery. And the way you guys responded, the way this whole school responded, was one of the highlights of my life. I'm not exaggerating at all. You guys raised $11,000 to get people out of slavery in Sudan. It's enough to get 100 people out and buy female goats for all of them, so they have something to start their lives over with when they're free. So thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce you to one of these people. The woman on the right in this picture is named Angom. The woman on the left is named Abuk, and they're sisters. And in 1999, Angom was abducted by northern slave raiders. She was visiting the market town, and the slave raiders attacked, destroyed the town, and they took her. And Abuk told me that when she heard that this town had been attacked, and her sister never came back from going to the market, she realized that her sister must have been abducted and taken into slavery. And she told me that she felt physically ill from the grief and the horror at what had happened to her sister. But she also told me that she believed that if her sister hadn't been killed, then God would bring her back someday. So for 15 years, whenever she heard that CSI was bringing a group of people back from slavery in the north, she would go to meet that group of people and look for her sister. And this year in February, her sister was finally there. And this is them together for the first time in 15 years. There is so much evil in this world. But when we stand together, and when we live out our calling to be the body of Christ, and to care for each other as much as we care for ourselves, this is the kind of thing that we can make happen. So please keep that in mind. Now, Iraq. Iraq has been at war in one way or another for almost 34 straight years. And America has been involved in a lot of those wars. So when we here in America think about Iraq, we usually think of it as a war zone. But I want us to think of it as more than a war zone. Iraq is home to one of the oldest, if not the oldest, civilizations in the world. When God chose Abraham to be the ancestor of the Jewish people and to settle in the Promised Land, he was living in a place called Ur of the Chaldees in Iraq. The prophet Jonah convinced the entire city of Nineveh, one of the mightiest cities in the world at the time, to repent. Nineveh is in Iraq. The prophet Nahum was born in a city called Al-Kosh in northern Iraq. The prophet Daniel lived in Iraq when he prophesied the coming of the Messiah. And he had such a big impact there that 500 years later, when Jesus Christ was born, it was wise men from Iraq who remembered Daniel, who traveled to Judea to find the Christ child. And even though the Assyrians and the Babylonians, the people who lived in Iraq, were often at war with Israel, it took the Israelites into captivity in Iraq, the prophet Isaiah predicted that one day the Assyrians and the Babylonians would come to know God. He said that there would be a highway connecting Assyria with Jerusalem, and that the Assyrians would go to Jerusalem to learn about God. Isaiah said, "The Lord Almighty will bless them, saying, 'Blessed be Assyria, my handiwork.'" This prophecy came true. After Jesus returned to heaven, his apostles traveled the world, preaching the good news of salvation. The apostles Thomas and Thaddeus went to Iraq and brought the gospel to the Assyrians. The Assyrians were one of the first nations in history to convert to Christianity, and the Assyrians have been Christians ever since. Now, 600 years after Jesus came, Iraq was conquered by the Islamic Empire, and other peoples moved into it, the Arabs, the Turks, the Kurds, and more. But the Assyrians still live there. They still speak Aramaic, the language of Jesus, and they are still Christians. When the United States was getting ready to invade Iraq in 2003, I don't remember hearing anyone talk about the Christians in Iraq. I didn't even know there were Christians in Iraq. I thought all Iraqis were Muslims. But there were over 1.5 million Christians living in Iraq in 2003, just 11 years ago. Today there are less than 400,000 Christians left in Iraq. What happened? Where did the other 1,100,000 Christians go to? Well, one of those 1,100,000 people is a friend of mine. I'll call him Louis. I met him when I was living in Syria 4 years ago. Louis's father is an Iraqi Christian man who was a successful businessman in Baghdad. And one day in 2007, Al-Qaeda came for him. They found him right in front of the police station in his neighborhood, shoved him into a car, and kidnapped him. They kept him for 4 days, torturing him. And they called his wife, and they said, "If you want to see your husband again, you have to give us $200,000. That will be your payment for living as Christians in a Muslim country." And his wife said, "Sorry, we don't have $200,000. Please give us back his body after you kill him." My friend was very fortunate. They eventually decided just to let him go. And they said, "You can live, but we will take your house. That will be your payment for living as Christians in a Muslim country." I have other Iraqi friends whose fathers were never returned after being abducted. They simply disappeared. After all this, Louis's family fled to Syria and settled in a Christian neighborhood of Damascus. That's where I met them, and that's where they lived until 2 years ago, when terrorists started bombing their neighborhood to kill Christians. After that, they moved the whole family to another country in the Middle East, Lebanon. But they weren't allowed to work in Lebanon, and although Lebanon is still relatively peaceful, violence from the Syrian civil war is starting to spill over. So they got very lucky again, and they found a way to move to Canada. Their youngest son is 10 years old, and he's already had to flee 3 different countries because he's a Christian. My friend Louis's dad is just one of thousands of Christians in Egypt, Syria, and Iraq who have been kidnapped in the last few years. Some of them were let go for ransom money. Most of them weren't. Most of them were killed or forced to marry Muslim men or simply disappeared, were never heard from again. Other people were killed in bombings or shooting sprees in churches and Christian neighborhoods. Other people had men in black masks come to their front door and say, "You have 3 days to leave, or we'll kill you." In the worst attack on Iraqi Christians, Gunmen from Al-Qaeda walked into a church in Baghdad during a worship service and opened fire. They killed 60 people, including many children. So what is going on here? Across the Middle East right now, there's a struggle going on. A struggle to define what these countries are, to decide what they will be. And right now, the most powerful groups involved in this struggle say, we want our countries to be Islamic states. We want our law to be Islamic law. We want everyone in our country to be Muslims. And we want everyone to worship God the same way. The plan these groups have for the future of their countries doesn't have any room for Christians in it. Christians don't fit the plan. These groups say, if the Christians want to stay in our countries, they either have to become Muslims or pay us a lot of money. Otherwise, they have to leave or be killed. I want to make sure I say this. Not all Muslims think this way. Most Muslims don't think this way. Most Muslims don't want to be at war. They're normal people. Normal people don't like war. Most Muslims have no problems with Christians. I have an Iraqi Muslim friend who's risking her life right now to help Christian refugees in Iraq. But these extremist groups are still very powerful. And in Iraq, in the last 11 years, they forced over 1 million Christians to flee the country to get away from terrorism. Most of the Christians who stayed in Iraq still fled their homes. They just fled to a different part of the country, an area called the Nineveh Plain. This is an area around the ancient city of Nineveh, which is called Mosul today. It's the homeland of the Assyrian people, and for most of the war, it's been very peaceful. It's a beautiful place. I've been there twice. It's not desert. It's very green. It's safe. There are churches there almost as old as the New Testament. When I would go there with CSI, we would bring food and medicine and clothing to the Christians who had fled there, and we would listen to their stories. Students of DMCS, I have bad news for us, because just in the last 2 months, the situation in Iraq has gotten a lot worse. 3 weeks ago, a group that calls itself the Islamic State took over the Nineveh Plain. The people who were supposed to be protecting the Nineveh Plain all ran away, and the 200,000 Christians who lived there had no choice but to flee for their lives. This entire area of Iraq, where all my Iraqi friends used to live, is now empty of Christians. And to understand why all the Christians fled, you have to know what the Islamic State is. This group is also called ISIS sometimes in the news. This is a group that is so radical, so extreme, that Al-Qaeda kicked them out. Al-Qaeda said, hey guys, you're scaring us a little bit. We don't want to hang out with you anymore. You're too crazy. This is a group that literally crucifies its enemies. They execute people in groups of hundreds at a time, sometimes beheading them one by one. They force female doctors and patients at hospitals to cover their entire bodies to the point where it's impossible to actually treat people, which is what a hospital is for. And today they control 1/3 of Iraq and 1/3 of Syria. They're the richest, most well-equipped terrorist group in the world. And how they treat you depends on your religion. They divide people into 3 groups. If you're a Muslim, you're safe, as long as you do what they say. If you're not a Muslim and you're not a Christian, or you're the wrong kind of Muslim, then the Islamic State says you can be killed for any reason. There's a group of people in Iraq called the Yazidis, who aren't Christians and aren't Muslims. They have their own religion. The Islamic State has murdered thousands of Yazidis in the last 2 months, sometimes by beheading, sometimes by burying them alive. Thousands of Yazidi women have been kidnapped and forced into slavery by the Islamic State. A few weeks ago, 50,000 Yazidi people were trapped on a mountain in Iraq called Mount Sinjar. They were surrounded by the Islamic State. They knew that if they tried to come down from the mountain, they would be killed. Hundreds of people on that mountain died from dehydration and exposure before they were able to find a way to escape. So Muslims are one category, non-Muslims and non-Christians are another category, and right in between is where the Christians fall. Christians living in the Islamic State have 3 choices. They can convert to Islam, they can pay a heavy tax called the jizya and live as second-class citizens, or they can be killed. And to make sure everyone knows who the Christians are, this is what the Islamic State does in cities they control. Sorry, I'm skipping past a few slides here. These are the people who were killed in that church attack I was talking about. It's me. That's the Islamic State. Boy, I really breezed past this. This is what the Islamic State does to Christian homes in the cities they control. They spray paint this red symbol on Christian property. This is the Arabic letter N for Nazarene. The letters in black above it say, property of the Islamic State. The Islamic State spray paints this sign on the homes of all the Christians in the territory they control, so that everyone will know the people living inside those homes don't have rights. If you've studied World War II at all, this picture probably reminds you of something. When the Nazis were preparing for the Holocaust, they did the same thing to Jewish houses, Jewish shops, and Jewish people. Jewish shops were marked with signs, and Jewish people had to wear special badges called the Yellow Star. Distinguishing and singling out people marked for oppression and destruction is a necessary part of a genocide. So to escape the Islamic State, the Christians of the Nineveh Plain, 200,000 of them, have fled their homes. Where did they go to? Nowhere, really. They had nowhere to go. The Nineveh Plain was the last safe place for Christians in Iraq, and now it's under the control of the Islamic State, as of just 3 weeks ago. The Christians have flooded into nearby cities. They're sleeping in parks, in churches, on sidewalks, in unfinished buildings. There are over 1,000 Christians sleeping on one floor of an abandoned shopping mall in one city. Shelter is scarce, and the harsh Iraqi winter is coming fast. Elderly and sick people have already started dying in the poor conditions. Have you ever wondered what you would have done if you were living during the time of the Holocaust? Have you ever wondered what you would do if it happened again? I have news for you, students of DMCS. You are. It is happening. Now. And so we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to live as a Christian in a time of genocide? My answer is that I think we have to go a little bit crazy. This man is named Raoul Wallenberg. During World War II, he was the Swedish ambassador to Hungary. Hungary was controlled by the Nazis, and the Nazis there were trying to exterminate the Jewish population. But Raoul Wallenberg knew that the Nazis wanted to have a good relationship with Sweden, and so he convinced the government of Hungary to allow him to issue special passes to people in Hungary that would mark them as citizens of Sweden, really, and protect them from abuse. And once he got this permission, he started handing out these protective passes by the thousands to Jews in Hungary. At one point, when the Jews were being taken away to the death camps in trains, he would run after the trains, jump on top of them as they were moving, climb inside, and start handing out these passes to people. And then when the train stopped at the next place, he would demand that they all be let out as citizens of Sweden. That's a little bit crazy, right? But it worked. This man is credited with saving 100,000 Jewish lives. Unfortunately, he himself was captured by the Russians during the war, and he was never seen again. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Christian pastor in Germany when the Nazis came to power. Adolf Hitler tried to reorganize and control the church in Germany, and most pastors went along with it. But when Bonhoeffer realized what the Nazis planned to do to the Jews, Bonhoeffer began to write bravely about the responsibility of the church to protect the Jews. He said that it was the responsibility of Christians not only to help the victims who have fallen under the wheel, but to fall into the spokes of the wheel itself. Eventually, Bonhoeffer joined a resistance group against the Nazis, helping to smuggle Jews out of Germany and get word about the Holocaust to the outside world. By the end, this pastor was part of a plot to kill Adolf Hitler. And sadly for the world, the plot failed, and Bonhoeffer was captured and executed by the Nazis. That's a little crazy too, right? I don't think my pastor has ever tried to kill anybody, as far as I know. And thankfully, we don't live in Nazi Germany. We face very few dangers here in America. We are not persecuted in this country, and we should thank God for that. But then how should we respond to the genocide of Christians on the other side of the world? This is my boss. He's in Iraq right now, right on the front lines of this war. People have told me they think that's a little crazy, and I kind of agree with them. But he's there to go to the Christians living on the streets, sleeping in parks, crowded into shopping malls, to bring them things: food, diapers, tomatoes, rice, flour, cooking stoves, coats, blankets, insulin, clean water, basic medicine, things that we don't think twice about here in America, but things that Iraq's fleeing homeless Christians are literally dying to get. This is me with a family that had to flee the Islamic State's takeover of the city of Mosul. If you or your family would like to donate to help get this relief aid to Christians and other people in Iraq, you can go to our website, www.csi-usa.org, and a figure that we like to say is that about $60 can feed a family of 5 for a month. And we don't only distribute food, we distribute stoves, medicines, blankets, other things like that. But this is just to give you an idea of what that amount of money can accomplish. In Ephesians 6, the Apostle Paul writes, "Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand." I'm telling you guys, when I read about Nazi Germany in history books, and when I look at the videos that the Islamic State puts on YouTube, I don't just see flesh and blood. Evil is at work in our world. The day of evil is here, and death is evil's strongest weapon. But we serve a God who is stronger than evil and stronger than death, and we need to act like it. When I was talking to Mrs. Oakes about chapel today, she sent me a list of questions to consider as I was putting this talk together. And one of them was, does it make a difference to pray when I don't know any specific people to pray for? And to that I would say, yes, of course, praying always makes a difference. But then I thought, that's a great idea. So I'm going to give you some specific people that you can pray for today. Pray for a friend that I'll call George. It's not his real name. George is a Christian from Syria, and he's 19 years old. He's one of the smartest people I know. He speaks perfect English without an accent, and he's never been inside an English class. He just watches movies and listens to music. I can't imagine that. His family fled from Syria into Iraq in February to get away from the Islamic State. And this month his family had to flee again to get away from them again. So pray that they will be safe. Pray for a family I met in the Nineveh Plain last Christmas. I'll call them the Kassab family. They gave me this bracelet that I'm wearing today, and that I wear every day to remember them. They fled their home in Baghdad after masked men came to their door and told them to leave or they would be killed. They had a store in Baghdad, but they lost everything when they left, and they weren't able to find work after that. 2 of their children are very sick and actually psychologically traumatized because of the horrible things they saw during the war, and they struggle to buy medicine for these 2 children. I don't know where they are now, but I can only assume that they've had to flee again because the city where I met them, where they were living, is now under the control of the Islamic State. Please pray that they will find a safe place to stay and that their children will remain healthy. Pray for this little girl in this fuzzy image. She's 3 years old. Her name is Christina. And according to news reports, when Islamic State fighters with guns came to her home in the Nineveh Plain and forced her family to leave, they took Christina away from her family, and they haven't seen her since. Pray that she's safe wherever she is and that her family will eventually find her. And that is all I have to say, guys. Thank you so much for listening.